Good evening, everyone. It is April the 10th, 2018, which means you have joined us for tonight's webinar session with the National Humanities Center and the Humanities in Class webinar series. Our session tonight is titled Confronting the Past, Russian Fiction in the 20th and 21st Century. And I'm extremely pleased to be joined by two different guest leaders tonight. One, Julia Trubahinka from Hunter College, and Nadia Kalman from the Words Without Borders campus. My name is Andy Mink, and I am the Vice President of Education at the National Humanities Center. I'm very pleased that you're able to join us after what I'm imagining to be a long school day with your students. I've looked through the roster, and I'm always amazed at the wonders of long-distance technology. We've got participants tonight from the West Coast, a lot of folks from Los Angeles, as usual, California. We also have many folks from New York and Florida. I see Texas in the room tonight, and of course North Carolina and the South is represented well as well. This webinar will work very much based on your participation. And although you can't see us, and you can hear us, and you can follow along with the associated PowerPoint, we are going to depend quite heavily on your comments in the chat box. That chat box is located at the bottom of the Go to Training Control Panel column, and I'd invite you to introduce yourself, say hi, greet us, give a high five to your neighbor, let us know where you're from, and also to register any thoughts, any questions, any responses in that chat box to the conversation that you hear tonight. I'll be, as the moderator, I'll be mining those questions and interjecting some of them into Julia as she gives her presentation. And as it turns out, because we have two guests tonight, Nadia will also be in the chat box and answering on the fly. So if for some reason you ask a question and it scrolls up and we sort of lose sight of it, don't hesitate to ask it again or to highlight it, or if you need to private message any of the three of us. Your participation does come with a certificate of attendance. I do understand and I appreciate your patience with the technology. Sometimes there's a little bit of a hang up in getting this. Well, we're always more than happy to respond to your emails if for some reason you have a hard time downloading your certificate. What should happen is that at the end of the webinar, you'll get a survey. After completing that survey, you'll get a link that allows you to download that certificate. And once you've got those hours certified, you can take them to your administration or put them in your teaching portfolio and show that you've spent 90 minutes with the National Humanities Center in this PD. The National Humanities Center is now in our 40th year of the support of humanities scholarship and education. Each year we have a cohort of university professors who apply for and receive a fellowship to come to Durham, North Carolina, and spend the year doing their good work, whatever that work might look like. Research, writing, conversing, editing, and what's more likely of late, digital projects. Our goal in the education department is to create bridges then from that research and that scholarly world to the world of the classroom. And we very much enjoy working in classrooms at the K-12 level, but also the post-secondary level in universities and community college and small liberal arts schools. From my point of view, one of the most important things, one of the most important elements of being a good teacher is knowing a lot about your content. And we hope that these webinars, including tonight's, gives you a chance to really experience and explore new content and grow your own knowledge and your own confidence in navigating that content. Oftentimes, the ways that we create these bridges come in the kinds of free and open online resources. We do have a deep repository of lessons that are located in our America in Class online repository. These webinars, again, are a fantastic way to put teachers and scholars in conversation with one another. It's a little bittersweet that we're wrapping up our season this year. We've had a very successful season. We've sold out more than half of our sessions. And in fact, I just finished completing next year's schedule, which will be released and announced on August the 15th. So put that on your calendar. We'll be getting a lot of notes via social media and our constant contact to keep an eye on that slow reveal so you can sign up for the webinars that are of interest to you. We're also very interested at the Humanities Center in making visible the process of this kind of scholarship. That is to say that there's a body of knowledge, there's things to know, but there's also a way of knowing it. And we're very interested in making visible that process for teachers and for students to really practice the craft of doing different disciplinary practices. One such resource that we've developed at the center is an iBook that you can download for free from iTunes. This compilation captures the conversations between 10 scholars and 10 teachers in 10 different fields, including the 10 that are listed on the screen in front of you. And what we've asked them to do is articulate the value and the practice of their fields, and to then create a very interactive, very multidisciplinary, very media-saturated resource that classrooms and teachers can use to try to shine some light on what it really means to think in and work in and research in and teach in these different fields. I'd encourage you to go and download that from iTunes, and then we have various associated activities with each chapter, including webinars that we will add to the series both this year and finally, we also have a Teachers Advisory Council that has been very instrumental in helping us stay relevant and create materials that are applicable for the classroom. I think what we're finding is that oftentimes our materials are curricular in nature, meaning it is content that you teach and that helps you, that provides resources that helps you teach it a better way. But we also create a lot of extracurricular materials, meaning humanities resources that aren't necessarily in your standardized curricula or those things you have to teach, but they do provide rich and deep and broad skills that you can use to help your students make better sense of the world we live in. And from my view, the standards are certainly an important part of your teaching responsibility, but it's being able to teach outside of those margins also is important for the climate and culture of your classroom. We're very, very pleased to partner with different organizations, particularly in our webinar series. And tonight, we have partnered with Words Without Borders campus, which is located in New York City. I'm going to actually invite Nadia Kalman to share a little bit more about Words Without Borders. I think you'll find, all of you will find, that this is just a wonderful resource that you can use in your classroom and for your own professional development. And Nadia, if you'll give me a moment, I'm going to unmute you and ask you to tell us a little bit more about Words Without Borders. Just one second. Nadia, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
And Nadia, I've also given you control of my laptop for what it's worth. So you can now advance the slides.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, I see. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Nadia Kalman. I'm a former English teacher in the New York City Public Schools, and I'm now the editor and curriculum designer for Words Without Borders campus. I apologize in advance for any technical difficulties I may have. This is the second time I'm using this technology. I'm just going to briefly introduce you to the materials that are on the site and then pass it on to Julia. Okay, so we developed Words Without Borders campus. It's an organization called Words Without Borders that's been publishing international literature for more than a decade. But we saw that there were some gaps between people who wanted to read the literature and people who were actually reading it. So for instance, teachers came to us and said that they were interested in teaching the literature in their classes, but that they didn't have enough background information to feel confident in it. And then when we surveyed students, we found out that almost all of them said that they wanted to read international literature, but that 40%, and these are students in mostly college, some high school, said that they had never read any of it at all. So we're hoping that our website can help address that. We provide full text literature, short stories, graphic literature, poems, essays for free online, and we also provide teaching tools and a lot of multimedia contextual materials, whatever may have inspired the author or can help students understand the culture behind the work. So you'll find films, music, artwork, photo essays, maps, and we can talk about that in more detail. But we've assembled the literature by country and also by theme. So you'll see one of the themes that spans all the cultures that we've worked on, leaving home, to your right. And then to your left, you'll see the beginning of the Russia unit. We were very lucky to have scholar and author Julia Trubihina write the introduction to the Russian literature on the site, and she is also the person who will be presenting tonight. Julia is a scholar, a poet, and an author with a PhD in comparative literature from New York University. She teaches at Hunter College at the City University of New York. Her own sources has been featured in numerous anthologies, and she is also the author of several books. So thank you, everyone. I will be in the chat box to talk to you while Julia is presenting, if anyone has any questions or anything comes up for you. And I will now pass it over to Julia.
Thanks so much, Nadia. And again, I want to emphasize that you will be a presence in our chat box, and maybe you can also add the link to your site into the chat box so folks can just click it and immediately go to it if they want to open a separate browser or sort of work with it on the side. So Julia, I've just unmuted you, and I'm so pleased that you can join us tonight. Can you hear me, Julia?
Hi, yes, I can hear you very well.
Good. So I've also given you the mouse, and we're anxious to hear all of what you have to share, but take it away.
Can you hear me well, everybody, I hope? Hi, my name is Julia Trubihina. I am an adjunct associate professor of Russian at Hunter College, CUNY. Very, very happy to meet all of you, if only virtually today. Thank you, National Humanities Center and Words Without Borders for making this webinar possible. I am very honored to share some of my ideas today and hopefully get some feedback from you, from all your varied perspectives and experiences. And please feel free to ask any questions. I hope, Andy, you can moderate and interrupt if I'm speaking too fast, or if I'm taking too much time or I have to wrap it up. I hope to answer some of your questions or suggest possible answers to other questions, or perhaps we can come up with some solutions together. Before we start, let me say just a few words about myself, my academic interest and teaching experience, which inevitably affect and influence both the question I ask and the answers I seek. I have been both a scholar and teacher and translator all my life, a literary translator and other translations as well, academic translator. My keen interest in translation from the time I did my PhD in comparative literature at NYU is understandable given my background. Like the author I wrote my dissertation and then a book about, Vladimir Nabokov, I have always been trying to bridge cultures and to think of translation, I would say, not just in the most direct sense of the word, but also as a crucial venue into literary history and theory, philosophy, and interpretation. Let me see if I can navigate this technology. Yes, oh wait, not very well. Here. I just want to show you briefly this slide. These are my two latest books, 2016, 2017. The first one is The Translator's Doubts, Vladimir Nabokov and the Ambiguity of Translation. The book on translation, it has received the Samuel Schumann Prize in 2016. And the second, What We Saw from This Mountain, is a volume of an important contemporary Russian poet, Vladimir Aresov, the first one in English by him, that I translated in collaboration with Betsy Hulick and edited. And I also wrote an introduction and a long interview with the poet. Arestov's poetics is to some extent similar to that of American language poetry. So apparently, unbeknownst to us, we tapped into something very much alive and important in American poetry, and we've been getting tremendous response to this little book, and it makes me very happy. I had earlier translated Susan Howe, Nathaniel Tarn, Anthony Hecht, and other English and American poets into Russian. So translation is sort of an ongoing project, and I'm working on translations of important Russian woman poet Yelena Schwartz. At Hunter College, where I teach, this broader perspective of cultural translation is especially viable. As you know, New York City, and I see some fellow New Yorkers, it's very pleasant to me to see fellow New Yorkers here. New York City is in and of itself the most multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural, multilingual place in the country, and Hunter College, as part of the City University of New York, is a reflection of this situation. More than 23,000 of our students who pursue various undergraduate and graduate degrees in many areas come from a huge variety of backgrounds, and over 50% of our students belong to ethnic minority groups. And though these numbers might be a little old, maybe a few years old, a graduating class at Hunter easily represents 60 countries, speaks about 59 or 60 different languages. 71% of our students are born outside the United States or have at least one foreign-born parent. I teach a variety of courses in language, in culture, in literature, both in English and in Russian. And among my comparative literature courses is, for example, a very understandably popular course in vampires, not only Slavic vampires. In the last few years, with an exception of this vampire class, I have been teaching mostly Russian heritage students, which is a rather unusual situation across the country nationwide. New York has the highest percentage of children of Russian emigres. And as a result, unlike many Russian programs around across the nation, we actually do not experience problems with enrollment. As an example, I teach advanced seminars for heritage students in Russian poetry, 18th and 19th century and 20th century. And they regularly enroll beautifully, sort of in advanced, in prominent graduate programs like Princeton. That might be a situation. We teach the undergraduates. I feel very lucky. However, the fact that many of our students are Russian, and some even can speak Russian, fewer can read in Russian on a decent level. However, this doesn't change the fact that it is increasingly hard to teach literary texts that are as foreign to them as they might be to monolingual American students. And this is our agenda today. So I'm on to this slide that shows more or less the questions that I hope to discuss today. As you can see, some essential problems of teaching foreign literary texts, Russian in particular, contextualizing texts, and finally, I hope to get to it soon, attending to specific Russian texts of short fiction or excerpts, as well as tentatively looking into the future with the last two texts. As far as I understand, you had an opportunity to acquaint yourself with these texts ahead of our seminar.
Julia, may I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
Julia, in terms of your work as a translator, in terms of your work as an expert in literature in two different languages, what would you say is the trickiest or the hardest part about translating Russian literature to English language? What do we lose or gain in that translation?
Well, it depends. If you translate poetry, you know the expression that what you lose in translation is poetry. This is not necessarily so, and I myself translated poetry primarily. But if you translate poetry, the prosody is different, the experience is different. You practically there's no sense in trying to translate rhymes. That changes the experience of a poem considerably. And while certain, especially contemporary texts such as Aristov, who doesn't rhyme, the book that I translated, it's sort of easier to convey. It's close to language poetry. If you're working, say, with the 19th century, it's extremely hard to convey why it is so great.
Right.
People always say, people who don't read Russian, they always say, we don't understand what's the deal with Pushkin, right? Like, why is he so great? So it's when you work with prose texts, it's of course a different challenge, and there very often you deal with the extra literary or with the same problem of contextualization, because a lot of realia, just the details of Russian that Russian prose continuously deals with, seem unfamiliar. So what do? Do you displace this into footnotes? Do you create some kind of explication or way of explaining it within the text? So there are various challenges that you face.
Great. Thank you so much.
Let's get on with the agenda, and I am on that infogram, the now famous but also very much disputed infograph by Robert Brewer, which has been doing circles on social media for quite a while now. When it first created a stir, he had numbers that looked even more striking. These numbers already look pretty striking. As you can see, reading frequency declines after age 8. 25% of those over the age of 16 have not read a book in the last year. 34% read, only 34% read on the proficient level, and so on. Later, as his infograph was very much discussed and also very much criticized online in blogs and social media, he realized that there were some miscalculations, came up with this one, though the original one still keeps popping up in my newsfeed every now and then. It has been disputed too, and we know that statistics might be closer to art than science. I can't dispute or support the numbers. I'm not a statistician to even evaluate them. The conclusion on making it in small font, so I wonder if you can see it, that one can just turn into an international expert in one's chosen field by simply reading an hour a day in his field for 7 years seems pretty dubious to me. However, I brought in this infograph more as sort of inflammatory entry point. Most of us teachers who teach literary texts and have been teaching for a while know empirically that students are reading less. The attention spans shorten in the advance of social media, and the larger majority of students get information exclusively from the internet without much understanding of how to evaluate the sources or how to be skeptical or critical about them. The striking example of the same trend on the national scale, but involving adults in general, was, for example, the fake news in the election year. I will give you an example. We all know that the millennials and post-millennials, or whatever the next ones are called, are more visual than logocentric. So 7, 8 years ago, maybe, when I was teaching, I knew that I could show a film in class, maybe a screen version of a literary text, to make them focus better and sort of cement the narrative in their mind. And I started noticing lately that the students are experiencing very similar problems following and understanding long format cinematic narrative as those that they're experiencing with the literary text, because the attention span, mightily influenced by the advance of social media and cell phones, has radically shortened. communication sort of happens in the formats of this TV installments that are interrupted by commercial breaks, or like sort of the length of text messages. So last semester in the vampire class, when I was teaching vampire class, I mentioned earlier, I decided to experiment. One of the classical 19th century vampire texts that we are reading, entitled Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, which I sort of think is like female Dracula. It is the origin for all contemporary women and lesbian vampires in literature and mass culture, and has been cinemized many, many times, including The Hunger with Catherine Deneuve and David Bowie in the 1980s. So last year, Netflix came up with a new Carmilla miniseries, and they are 7 to 10 minutes each episode. The action, of course, is made contemporary, and the characters are made into students on some fictitious, quote unquote, Austrian, not very Austrian campus. And this went splendidly. This was their format. They responded so very well to that. It sort of spoke, so to speak, spoke to their condition. So, okay, just, I'm not going to spend a long time on the next two slides, but look at some thoughts from the American Comparative Literature Association 2018 seminar for BA students. What we are dealing with, it's all about online social media, the average social media user maintaining 5 accounts, print books becoming niche market, and social media encouraging authorship of extreme points of view. The next one, I'll just go to teaching Russian literary texts. So I will not probably go in the order of these bullet points, but I will very gladly talk about the ones that interest you most. And please draw my attention. I have difficulty switching from the slides to the chat box. So if there is something that I should be answering right now, please draw my attention to that, Andy.
And Julia, I'll be happy. I'll be happy to interject questions, and I think Nadia is also going to be answering in the chat box.
Thank you so much. So basically, the order here is like, why does need history in contextualizing Russian literary texts? How do we choose texts? How do we group them? What are the most challenging aspects? What do students like, or what is more difficult for them? The role of the extra literary that I found I have to deal with in teaching Russian literary texts, but I don't know if we have time to discuss that. And finally, close reading and experiencing the text and different points of entry. And I think I will start with the last one, with the points of entry, what they might be. And or maybe with one particular difficulty before talking about history. My example sort of deals strangely or paradoxically with language teaching, but we are not discussing language teaching. We teach a lot of language. In Hunter Russian program, we all teach both literature and language. And I have a very many years of experience teaching Russian at different levels to heritage students and to non-heritage monolingual Americans. We all know that grammar is not, or very little, formally taught, at least in public schools, in American public schools. So very often, American students encounter grammar for the first time when they take foreign language in college. And I'm not not talking here about pros and cons of teaching grammar, but one crucial skill that grammar gives is the ability to see structural patterns and understand causality. And it's very hard. It's a transferable skill. It can be used in analyzing literature. So when with incredible effort I finally make a language student to recognize a pattern, the students often perceive it as some kind of eureka moment. So, but the same happens with the structural patterns of literary text. The vast majority of high school and undergraduate students read at the level of communication of information. The lack of this habit of recognizing structural patterns or appreciating the beauty of them make them often read, and this is in the best case scenario, when they actually read, for entertainment or for some very admirable ethical or social justice purposes, or the combination thereof, but seldom for the aesthetic pleasure the text gives, for its beauty. By the way, this is why a lot of my students hardly read any poetry before they actually took a poetry seminar with me. Or another thing that is very hard for them to appreciate, the wicked playfulness of many Russian texts, or irony often lost on them. Therefore, often they read, what they read basically is the plot. If the narrative is structurally ambiguous or difficult, or the moral of the text is not clearly communicated, they seem to be lost. As one student told me in my short story class, we were reading one of Chekhov's greatest stories, The Lady with a Lapdog. It's a beautiful and heartbreaking story of love and despair. And the student said, I really didn't like this story. I was amazed. I said, why? And the answer was the most unexpected answer. She said, because what they did was wrong. They committed adultery. This might have been an extreme case of reading exclusively on the level of the plot, also extreme sort of moral clarity. But this doesn't mean that the student is necessarily somehow immune to a more profound level of understanding a text. It means only that she, either because she was not she had not been exposed to complex texts that operate differently, or didn't have a habit of reading, that she doesn't have a point of entry in this text. We have to provide this point of entry. And these points of entry are varied. For example, in discussing that very text by Chekhov, I used to my advantage the fact that that particular class of students had only one very boisterous Russian guy, and all other students were women. The guy was an avid reader, and like many Russians, liked to argue. So he disliked the main female heroine of the story and very emphatically claimed that she was just stupid. This, of course, provoked all the women in the class sort of rise up in defense of the female heroine. And I just sat back, occasionally stirring up the heated debate. It was now heated. And in looking for arguments, the students inevitably had to find them in the text itself. And lo and behold, they soon arrived, without me telling them that, at the finding. The text, as practically always in the case with Chekhov, is entirely told from the perspective of the male protagonist, and the woman just didn't have a voice. Another example from the same Russian story class. Teaching a gorgeous, gorgeous little text, a short story by the first Russian Nobel Prize winner in literature, Ivan Bunin, emigre writer. It's entitled The Light Breath or Light Breathing, depending on the translation. This very short story is entirely about structure, to the extent that Russian structuralists used it as an example for structural analysis. The plot ostensibly is a story of a 16-year-old girl, a student in a pre-revolutionary Russian high school, who possessed a certain ineffable, so to say, attraction, which she herself did not fully understand. She was seduced by her father's friend, ended up being shot and killed by another jealous lover. When I say it this way, on the level of the plot, one might think that the story is entirely about sexual abuse. Yet it is not about it, or not primarily, but about the fragility and the ineffable fleeting quality or nature of beauty that makes one just rise in pity and sorrow, because as Nabokov used to say, the beauty is doomed to die. And the story, however, structurally is made in such a way that the mood and impression it creates is completely opposite from the impressions that are caused by the events. As you heard, the plot line is pretty tragic. So the true theme is the light breath of life, or the light breathing of life, not the muddled life of a provincial schoolgirl. Sort of life's transparency, delicacy, its crystal quality, its lightness. And the entry to that story, to that particular story, was quite unexpected. It was a fascinating discussion that drew on semiotics of fashion and clothes. Well, we know that Roland Barthes writes about it, but the students never heard of Barthes, and it didn't matter. So we started sort of discussing the most popular girl in their high school class and what she looked like. And at first it was just the usual teenage stuff. Who were the cool crowd, you know, this kind of stuff. But soon, with a little bit of prompting, it was about that one particular person who was not necessarily dressed in popular brands, but and here they were clearly making an effort to articulate and didn't quite succeed. Like, she wore her hair this way. I don't know how, but it always looked different. Or she always tied that scarf, and I don't know what it was, but soon everybody tied their scarves like that. Today, we would call such a girl an influencer or trendsetter. And one student actually said, I was that girl. The amazing thing was that the women students all remembered with incredible clarity the minute details of that popular girl's clothes, bearing, looks, and how they were different from those of all the rest, and for no clear reason. And it was now suddenly personal that the heroine of the story was that girl, and clear why various people in the story kept talking about her when she was alive and remembering her when she was dead. And then the structure suddenly made sense to them. The light breath or breathing, the self-characteristic of the heroine and the title of the story comes at the end, and sort of this breathing dissolves into thin air, into nostalgia, into that profound sadness of being. So I actually want to stop my talking and ask you, what points of entry do you look for when you teach literary texts?
Thank you, Julia. And we're going to pause for a moment and give our audience a chance to share their thoughts, give you a chance to catch your breath.
Thank you.
We'll see what kinds of choices that they're making. We'd love to hear from you in terms of those texts that you use.
Or the entry points.
Yes. can see by looking at the chat box, there's a lot of agreement with some of the points that you've made, in particular, how students focus on plot.
I see we did a problem by Chekhov, and my students struggled too. They were focused on the plot as well. I see, yeah. You know, I might also suggest something. You know how we all know this conundrum. Just because a student happened to have read one other book sometime, he or she thinks that any new text there is meaningfully connected to the specific text that he or she had read, just because that happened to be the text that they read. So I love creating, at least within the space of a specific class, some sort of rhymes that make previously read text cross-referential. For example, after we read Chekhov, The Lady with the Lapdog, in the story, Russian story class, we will be reading Lyudmila Petrushevskaya, Lyudmila Petrushevskaya's story, The Lady with the Dogs. We are reading Petrushevskaya for this webinar, the story Milgrom. And she quite obviously and ironically references Chekhov. And I like creating this kind of rhymes.
See a lot of comments about using current events as an entry point.
I do that too. I actually was going to talk about it a little bit when I talk about history. News.
Yeah,
current events. I find it very interesting that if they know about current events, it also comes mostly from social media, and very often from shows like Colbert, for example, but never from newspapers.
Looks like they have many of the same thoughts. Julia, we might want to start going through your slides here now. We've got about half an hour, 40 minutes or so.
Okay, we are moving forward. So let me say what I find. Let me see what the next slide of ours is. Oh, we had also history, right? And the next one is already, no, let me go back, I'm sorry. So what I find most difficult about teaching Russian fiction is where we are on question 1 of the slide. You have been reading some stories for today's webinar, and you probably found that they were extremely difficult to penetrate if one had absolutely no historical context. To contextualize Russian fiction, one simply needs history. Yet our students lack relevant knowledge of history, often any history. Everything that happened before their living memory is simply long ago. And you might have noticed that the camps, the Gulag, the terror, the purges, the arrests, creep up into almost every piece that we read for this webinar. Sometimes it's the 5th paragraph, sometimes the 3rd, but certainly it's there in the first page in most texts. It is obvious that something eminently essential about the Russian 20th century experience is at stake when we talk of any Russian texts that deal with the Soviet past and post-Soviet present. It's sort of a battle between cultural, historical, and individual memory on the one hand, and state-sanctioned amnesia, the repeated trauma, and the painful deferral of understanding or interpretation of the past. These motives seem to be shared by the text in all of the clusters that you can read on that page of World Without Borders in the Russian collection. So now let's talk of the text to be more specific. So the first author we've read is Svetlana Alexievich, and I'm sure you heard her name. She was 2015 Nobel Prize in Literature winner. She's a Belarusian non-fiction writer. She works with oral stories, oral history. She is a Belarusian journalist, but she writes in Russian. And she was known throughout her career for creating a collective Soviet voice from the polyphony of oral testimonies by individual Soviet people. Her text I so much recommend. They are translated into English. The recent beautiful translation of her book, Time Secondhand, or Secondhand Time, translated by Bela Shayevich. I often teach her most famous book, which is The War Has Non-Womanly Face. It's translated differently, but doesn't have a woman's face. It's the stories of Soviet women during World War II. In the story the excerpt that we read comes from the collection The Wondrous Deer of the Eternal Hunt. 100 Soviet men and women of different generations resurrect their very personal memories of desire, quest for happiness, failure to find happiness. And I use the quotes. They're rather long, but you read the fiction, so they're sort of like a prop for me to keep me on the point. In the excerpt that we read, Gleb, the narrator's lover and then husband, is a man who is profoundly marked and profoundly damaged by his labor camp experience. He is a son of the enemy of the people. Children were responsible for parents, and he himself was a prisoner of the Gulag from the age of 16 to nearly 30. And still he would not trade that experience for anything because it truly shaped his identity. The suppressed years of torture, he was tortured by light, we read, and he was probably raped as a teenager in prison. And suppressed years of fear concealed what his alternative identity might have been, a person he never had a chance to become. His appreciation of every moment of his happiness, of having a family, stems from the recognition of its fleetingness. His loneliness comes from a life that never allowed any space for privacy. And at the end, the narrator says that his real face only comes through in death. I'm quoting, "By morning he became handsome. The fear had left his face, and I saw his fine, elegant features, the face of an Oriental prince. That's the kind of man he really was. He had never been like that with me." The narrator is a woman who met Gleb at the age of 28. She is imperfect, she has affairs, yet she experiences feelings, as she puts it, as distinct beings, suffering, love, tenderness, almost the quote repeating verbatim the ending of the story Milgrom by Petrushevskaya that we all also read. Russian woman, she says, is prepared to suffer generation after generation and to nurse the lonely, ungainly, unhappy men, victims, martyrs, maimed by the wars and camps. Remember that in the camp, Gleb realizes that 1 in every 2 men did time. Back to nurse them back to some fragile semblance of normalcy. The war theme, the narrator says, is constant. And think of now, we talked of current events, Syria, Ukraine, it never seems to end. And the role of women emerges, and there's a lot to discuss here, as deeply patriarchal, as conservative, yet invested with almost religious connotations of Christian sacrifice and also power. I think the most amazing yet logical is that the ordinary, the humane emerges as the most important. Gleb says that being loved as a child is a reserve of love that will keep you afloat. And in that quote that you have here, we deal with yet another horrible aspect of state terror, the relationship between the informer and the denounced, between the victims and the executioners, which is roughly the entire country. And we learned that Gleb knew who had informed on him. I remember how I dragged my reluctant American-raised daughter to see the German film that won a foreign Oscar, The Life of Others. Like many other American high school students, she read Orwell, 1984, in school and didn't particularly like it. The film about East Germany's secret police Stasi and the lives of artists and intellectuals who later find out from reading their files after the collapse of communism and unification of Germany, which friend, which partner, or which lover had been the informer. That made a profound impression on my daughter, and she said, "Oh my God, I now understand 1984. Before it was so abstract." So look, Gleb doesn't want his former childhood friend to suffer in retaliation. He doesn't want to reiterate the same circle of violence because the informer has a mentally handicapped child. The informer cries at Gleb's funeral, and there is another issue to discuss there. The Soviet man's ability to compartmentalize. It strikes one, especially American, very often as profoundly immoral, as a lie. But we can discuss that as a terrifying tool of mental self-preservation and of survival. So next one is Petrushevskaya, Lyudmila Petrushevskaya. She's one of my favorite contemporary writers, a novelist, a playwright, winner of many, many national and international awards. And you can see the way she looks. She's an incredible clowness. She performs very successfully at her pretty advanced age as a cabaret singer. So the story that we read, Milgrom, is a story of a personal transformation, a sort of Russian Cinderella, a nameless 18-year-old girl into a young woman, Soviet woman, in a beautiful new dress. But this is only a way to tell a story of very different transformations and also transcendental permanence. She writes unsentimentally, as one American critic beautifully wrote, with a great artist's great heartlessness. Did you notice how the story is told in the narrative present? It's sort of now, but it is also always. The story repeats itself. The girl breaks out of her awkward shell with a new dress, but the story turns into a story of the eponymous seamstress, Milgrom. We know her name is Riva. She is an old Jewish woman with a life of unimaginable hardship, but she is mostly denied a first name. She's known as Milgrom. And by the way, talking of hardship, the camps appear at the end of the story's first page. But her personal story is not unlike innumerable other Soviet people's story. And we read, behind each window live only Milgroms. And in due course, the happy girl, in yet another inevitable transformation, will also turn into yet another Milgrom, whose undying love for her son, unrequited but undying love for her son, will be similar to what the now grown-up girl's love for her own son will be in the future. And in the stark and cruel scarcity of Soviet life shown in Petrushevskaya's unfrilled prose, transcendental and redemptive permanence transpires at the end. Look at the last sentence there. Nothing at all but a timid and tender love. That also resonates with Alexievich, right? Gleb's thoughts about how love in one's childhood gives a reserve to sustain one through the entire life. So I want to talk briefly about Chudakov, Alexander Chudakov. He was a Chekhov scholar, a very good one, and writer. He won the Russian Booker Prize for the Decade in 2011 for his novel, from which the first chapter is the text that we read. The title of the novel is "A Gloom is Cast Upon the Ancient Steppes." It's a verse, a poetic line from the Russian symbolist poet Alexander Blok. And our excerpt is Arm Wrestling in Chebachinsk. This novel is one of my favorite texts. It's translated now, it's been translated, I think it's either just was published or is being published basically as we speak. I so much recommend it. It chronicles with little sentimentality but great warmness and tenderness the multiple voluntary and forced transformations of many characters of the novel, including the autobiographical narrator named Anton, in the collective survival of Soviet people in the aftermath of the Great Terror, of the purges, and World War II. Predictably, as I told you, the camps are brought in sort of as a matter of factly. In page 1, Tanya, the daughter of Anton's grandpa, was a deported chasseur. This is an abbreviation, an acronym, which means a member of the family of an enemy of the people. There were special gulag camps for them. And then the other arm wrestler who arm wrestles with grandpa, Perepelkin, we are told, is from the deported kulaks. These are peasants who were purged in collectivization. I hope you notice how the grandpa magnanimously agrees to a tie in arm wrestling, because why embarrass the man? And this should also bring Gleb from the Alexievich excerpt to mind. And the priest brother of grandpa, Father Pavel, several pages into the text, is also described of having done time in the camps of Mordovia felling trees. Chebachinsk is a provincial town lost in the steppes of Kazakhstan, and it sort of becomes a modern day Babel. It's a native place for the Kazakhs. It's also a voluntary destination for Russian settlers, and involuntary place of forced exile of former Gulag prisoners of all nationalities. We read about the deported Chechens, about the Russian Germans. It sort of aptly exemplifies a collective Soviet experience as the country is transforming itself into a superpower emerging from the purges and the war. Its population, in order to survive, is transformed into scavengers, hustlers, innumerable Robinson Crusoes, getting by in a feudal subsistence economy. I don't know what the points of entry here might be. The novel subtitle is An Idyll, and with my accent, I don't know if I say it correctly, Idyll. I think a good point of entry is to explain what the idyll is and then dwell on the contrast. The family of the protagonist is an amazing family. It's loving, it's very hardworking, it's educated, I would say enlightened. At some point, Grandpa jokes that exiling intellectuals and scientists in mass to remote regions is a typical Russian solution to the promotion of culture. Many exiled intellectuals appear in the novel, and in our excerpt we have a German professor, Riesenkamp. They basically apply their vast knowledge to practical betterment of the exiles' existence. They also teach, so the kids in the local school are taught by the leading scientists, by the leading scholars. The grandfather comes from the priestly stock. He's from priest's family, and he describes this with pride. The grandma is from the gentry family. She was educated in the school for the girls of nobility. She meticulously keeps in exile the habits of disciplined, civilized life, keeps the face, as it were. Their linen is perfectly starched, and in the especially hungry times we read in the novel, the soup made of nettles is still served in the dinner plates with a family monogram. This is not just survival, it's a program of survival as preservation of moral and mental health. As in Alexievich and Petrushevskaya that we read, the highest value in these impossible circumstances is just the reserve of that tender love. Life not for the sake of something, but for the sake of families and self-preservation. But at the end, this turns out to be for the sake of larger history, for the sake of all. I think it's not accidental that Chudakov was a Chekhov scholar. He is the most Chekhovian of all the writers we read today. Chekhov also creates his stories seemingly out of nothing. They require work on the part of the reader who is led by Chekhov's suggestive power. Remember the ending of Dядя Vanya, of Uncle Vanya. Надо жить, дядя Ваня. You've got to live. You've got to go on, Uncle Vanya. So unless the student comes from the circumstances of rural poverty, how do we enter this experience? How do we enter this text? I think that our survival film narratives can become a useful tool, a way in, so to say, from The Road, 2009 post-apocalyptic film of survival by John Hillcoat, based on Cormac McCarthy's novel, to Hunger Games, the characters' resourcefulness, their will to live, their will to survive, the extraordinary circumstances.
Julia?
Actually, one of the
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I was trying to find a good place to insert this question. Tatiana Keeling has asked the following question, and I think Nadia and I both feel like you're the person to answer it, and that is, what is the grandfather's inheritance in the novel? The first chapter really ends on a cliffhanger.
Yeah, the ostensible inheritance is the house, and the novel keeps it unreserved, goes on the tangential threads, and eventually Anton does not inherit the house. The house goes to someone else, but the inheritance is not really the house. We are basically dealing with a symbolic inheritance, both of the past, the Soviet past symbolically, that is being sort of disputed the inheritance issues, collective memory informing all of these texts that we are looking at, but also for personally Anton, the real inheritance. Turns out that grandpa, all his relatives, grandmother, his father, all those characters, multiple characters, friends of the family, they sort of are part of his soul's and personality chemical composition, you know. That's what he inherits, really.
Thank you.
So I think we should move to Ключерёва. I can talk about Chudakov is one of my favorite texts, but we should move to Natalia Ключерёва, younger, as you can see by the date of birth, younger writer, Russian poet, prose writer, and journalist. And to her story that I bet you found most easy to read, and I think the students will find the easiest to approach. And the story is about Yurka Krivov, a boy, the young protagonist. The story is sort of a strange, unlikely Christmas story. We all know what Christmas stories are as a genre. And he also transforms himself, but he transforms himself into a mature adult very prematurely, in a desperate attempt to transform others, basically, as he says, to shut them out, right? Symbolic gesture. He shuts them out of the apartment, but he wants to, by locking them out, he wants to shut them out and to transform the alcoholic parents, and of course fails, right? And then he starts his own labor of survival, just like Chudakov's exiles in Chebachinsk. And he also transforms himself by changing his identity. He changes his name and his patronymic. Patronymic is the name of the father, sort of like our, well, it's not the same, but we have a middle name in English. Russians have the name and the patronymic, which makes the reading of Russian novels so difficult because everybody has these multiple names, right? So Yuriev comes from his first name, Yuri, and Alexeyevich, the patronymic, comes from the name of his tenant, Alex, the eternal student type, who in some way educated him and helped him survive. The changing of locks and the changing of names, that's of course symbolic. Note also that before that, the little Yurka himself gets shut out of the apartment on Christmas, and he has to survive in the cold under the stars. However, the real Christmas transformation happens, as we can see in the quote on the screen. It happens later, when he, who was treated with no compassion at all as a child, shows compassion and pity for his hapless and now demented mother in a mental ward in a hospital. The story starts with a broken promise. Here it's about patterns, about how it's made, of a Christmas tree that he was promised and never given. But it ends with a fulfilled promise when he brings a Christmas tree for his mother and agrees to play the role of her imaginary son, so to speak. This story doesn't talk of the camp. See at the end, why don't I? Yuriev agreed, and he too touched the tree. Why don't I? So we don't have the camps in this story, but it speaks. The story speaks of split identity, very much a Russian collective trauma, but also something that for many reasons is approachable in interesting ways for an American student. Did you find this text the most approachable? That's my question.
we'll
And
see.
I'm moving on quickly to our last two texts that are bringing us into today, into the 21st century. Hello?
Yes.
Okay, I thought I lost you.
Yeah, there we are.
Okay, so Dmitry Kuzmin in the picture, actually, he's with me. At Hunter College in 2014, I invited him to speak in our cultural series. We read for this webinar his nonfiction piece on the Moscow metro and being gay from the year preceding this talk at Hunter, 2013. Dmitry Kuzmin is an openly gay writer, translator, literary curator, founder of the Argarisk Publishers, and editor of the legendary internet project that was called Vavilon, which means in Russian Babel. It was the first internet platform that collected contemporary Russian poetry. Kuzmin is also a friend. In the piece that we read, he raises his voice in defense of gay rights in Russia and speaks extensively about his identity as a gay man. The quotes that I have are more. Wait, I'm sorry. I think I'm moving in the wrong direction. How do I get back?
Well, you stop clicking for a moment, and I'll get you back.
Thank you.
Sure.
To Kuzmin's quote, yes. So the quotes are more pointers for myself. They're rather long, but basically the main metaphor of the text is the metro, is the Moscow metro, which can be seen both as a locus of love and possibilities of communication, and space where no communication is possible, where passengers, as he puts it, are engaged in a never-ending warfare of all against all. And once again, the Stalinist Gulag experience is brought in the 5th paragraph of this text. The camp logic of survival. You die today, if I can live to tomorrow. The relationships between guards and prisoners that shape divisions between the slaves themselves. Kuzmin says, in such society, I'm quoting, those who are nothing treat others with state-sanctioned violence. Then he connects it to the gay experience. As the conductor shuts the door into passenger's face just because this is the little power that he has, because of the lack of respect for individual per se, the sense of superiority over another group fuels the anti-gay paranoia. With the Stalinist past dovetailing into the present in Putin's Russia, its infamous anti-gay laws become simply one of the ways to perpetuate, and I quote him, the system of state-sponsored violence, to find yet another channel for hatred. I think one of the striking images of this piece is the mother who is torn between pride for her son's first book and the fear that it will out him as a gay man. And so she cuts out the pages, and then she's ashamed and asks for another copy. So we can connect it to the previous text about excising parts of collective memory or parts of history on the scale of the nation. This is more than relevant today. Look, if we are talking about present events, Stalin is again the national savior, the national hero, and more groups in Russia find themselves ostracized. But as Kuzmin considers making public statements as an openly gay man his personal responsibility, while anti-gay hysteria in Russia reigns supreme, he nonetheless also envisions the future, and that's the end of the quote on the slide. It's sort of an "I have a dream" moment, not so distant future when sexual identity will be fluid and all classification system dividing people into categories will be replaced by the freedom to fall in love just because of the mutual attraction of free individuals. As he says there, to smile at someone beautiful in a metro car without having to think of the gender of that individual. So now to most heartbreaking and also most hopeful part of our presentation, the youngest of the authors, you see, 1978, Victoria Lamasca. She is a fascinating graphic artist. I absolutely love her art and follow her, and I'm friends with her on Facebook. She had a triumphant tour of American universities last year, and now her show on the eve, here you see the poster, on the eve, meaning on the eve of Putin's re-election, which has now happened. It's now open in Pushkin House in London. In this slide, you can see this is quite recent. This comes from her public Facebook. She's standing in front of the statement of the central metaphor of the show. It's snow. Snow concealing Russia, putting it to sleep. She writes, Russian intermittent thaws are as nothing to the cold snaps in which we live now. The protests of 2011-2012 against the fraud election, when Putin was just temporarily replaced by his seat holder Medvedev, are erased, and people are once again edged into private spaces. But the protest, the revolution, as she puts it, happens when these snowbound expanses are once again stirred into action. It's hopeful, and we see it with the new book, her new book, Other Russia. Other Russia does exist. We see street protests and Pussy Riot rally on the cover of her 2017 book. In her art, Lamasca asks these questions head on. What does it mean to live in Russia today? What is it like to grow up in a forgotten city? What is it to be a migrant worker? What does it mean to grow old in Russia and seek solace in the Orthodox Church? For the past 8 years, as a graphic artist and activist, Lamasca has been traveling around Russia, talking to people as she draws their stories. She spent time in dying villages where school teachers outnumber students. She stayed with sex workers in Nizhny Novgorod. She went to juvenile prisons. She attended every major political rally in Moscow. During the protests of 2012, she drew the protesters. She drew the special forces called OMON. She drew the provocators of pro-Putin youth groups, passers-by, feminists, skinheads, anarchists, even old babushkas, the grannies, who are always a very active part of street actions on either side. She also illustrated the Pussy Riot trial of 2012. So the story that I hope you looked at is also very relevant for American experience. The migrant workers in the Russian context, it's the national of the former Central Asia, such as republics, now the states, it's the former Soviet republics, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and especially often today Uzbekistan. Just try riding in a taxi in Moscow. I bet your driver will be an Uzbeki. And they are imported in droves as cheap manual labor. They are often underpaid, abused, stripped of any human rights. This particular story that you looked at, The Slaves of Moscow in the English version, is 6 years old. It's a now infamous case of the Galyanova food store, sort of like a mini market. And she originally published it as a reportage, The Slaves of Moscow Produkty grocery store, in several installments in 2012 on her blog. So in October 2012, a group of civil society activists freed 12 slaves from that grocery store. The interesting thing was that these natives of Central Asia were also enslaved by the native of Central Asia. So this crosses ethnicity. They were a Kazakhstani couple, Jansulu Istanbekova and her husband Saken Mujdibayev. Nearly all of the released were women from Shymkent in Kazakhstan. And it's also the Istanbekova hometown. She had a lover who was her patron and former prosecutor and now head of customs in Kazakhstan. So he helped to organize this and also cover up. So when I only put some slides here, you see various women slaves, Zarina and Layla, as they talk to Civic Assistant Committee lawyer, and she talks of real physical abuse. The boss lady ordered Becca the guard to break the fingers on those of my hands. Zarina says that the police in Moscow knew what was happening in the store, but they were paid off. They hushed it up. There are also children there. Some were born in captivity. Layla's son Bahit is used as a worker, abused child, used also to clean, to carry things, also as a plaything for the owner's son. When she has a daughter, she's shipped off back to Kazakhstan, and later the woman is told that her daughter is dead. She is lied to. Svetlana Ganushkina, who actually I knew since my youth, she is the mother of a friend who is a very prominent human rights activist. She basically is saying here that we hold press conferences at which we say nothing is happening, and this is the main message. So basically in November 2012, the couple was charged with false imprisonment, but the case against them was later dismissed as groundless, and they reopened the Produkty grocery store immediately after the new year and were again recruiting people. According to the United Nations, 500,000 to 2 million people are in bondage in Russia. So the last I love this is beautifully drawn picture, says the slide itself, we said goodbye, and as the slaves, the women slaves are liberated, and one of the civil assistant workers is carrying her son, and they're giving them some party and take them to eat, I think at McDonald's, I now don't remember. The women have plans of their own. The mother dreams of going to immigrating to Paris and going dancing. However, as we say goodbye, and she says goodbye, it's not very hopeful. We know that the life for migrant workers, for migrants, is not easy in Paris. There is no dancing for them, right? And I am leaving you here with these goodbyes. We have time for questions, and I would like now to have it as a dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We do have about 5 minutes left, and I know, Nadia, you'd like to share a few last comments as well. Perhaps what we should do is go straight to those slides, and then we can do questions at the very end. So, Nadia, I'm going to give you the mouse and unmute you as well. There's so much dense, wonderful material for us to get through. I think, there you go. Please.
Okay, thank you. To make time for questions, I'm not going to go through my PowerPoint really. I'm just going to say that now this last story, Slaves of Moscow, is up on the campus website with a lot of contextual materials, a lot of ways in. I sometimes recommend that teachers, instead of starting with students reading the text, instead assign them to read contextual materials that might be of interest in the context tab next to the story. So for this one, we have La Moscow's talk entitled Secrets of Comic Production, which might be interesting to students who are making their own comics. We have contemporary news reports as well as continuing coverage of the women's case as it developed. And we also have text from the translator who does his own writing about the migration issue in Russia on his blog, and has brought in a lot of unlikely connections. For instance, he connects one point to a De La Soul song. So anyway, all of that is up on the website. I will provide my email address and the website homepage in the chat. And with that, I'd like to make room for your questions.
Thank you, Nadia. And in fact, I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and forward through what these slides were. We'll get to the end.
I saw a question that the students really, or a comment that the students really liked the story by Ключерёва, the None of Your Business, and that they wondered about the absence of social services in Russia. And it is very true. So I have an ailing mother in Russia, and I basically had to organize a private care. I have hired live-in caretakers, and I, of course, come often to supervise, because to think of placing somebody in one of those institutions there is just simply dangerous. People won't live there long.
Julie, we do have one question from Carol Pixton. She asks, is contemporary Russian literature mostly protest literature in your view, just as it was in the 19th century?
It's an interesting question. I find that La Mosca so unusual because she is protest literature and she is cutting edge. She's now the things are happening now. And also I find that the most interesting literature to read is now nonfiction. And however, a lot of texts that are written now still deal with the Soviet past. It's like the Soviet past is unburied. It keeps coming back. And this inability to sort of move into the future is the most fascinating thing.
Thank you. I wish we could talk longer, but unfortunately our time is just about up. I want to thank you again, Julia and Nadia, for joining us in tonight's webinar. We really do appreciate you sharing these resources. We encourage all of our participants to go to the Words Without Borders website that's listed on the page. And Julia, thank you again for your expertise.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you for all of our participants in joining us tonight. Be sure to follow our social media, the National Humanities Center, to get updates on our upcoming both face-to-face and long-distance professional development opportunities. You can follow our Twitter feed, you can follow our Facebook and our Instagram to get all of the updated materials. Again, when we complete tonight's webinar, you will be prompted with a survey, and once completed, you'll be able to download your certificate for attending. Tonight's session was recorded, and we will have it on our website within 48 hours. My colleague Libby Taylor is back from maternity leave, so this should be done quickly and online so you can view it. There's so much dense, rich material here that it might be helpful to go back through with the PowerPoint and the recording and the readings and really spend some time lingering with the different points that Julia, the professor, is able to make. We've got 3 more webinars slated for this spring. 2 of them, unfortunately, are sold out, but we did add an extra one. That is a session with Bernie Carlson from the University of Virginia on government and aviation of the 20th century. We'd love for you to join us. Please go and sign up on our website. This webinar is scheduled for April 25th. And we decided to add it in part because of a recent cancellation that we had. We'd love to see you there. We'd love to see you at all of our future events. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great school day tomorrow, and good night.